Welcome to the Values Driven Leadership Series. I'm your host, Dr. Joni Carley, and my guest today is Dr. Ashok Gangadine. Ashok is professor of philosophy at Haverford College, where he's taught for the past 42 years. And throughout his career, he's focused on expanding philosophy and cultural life into a wider global context. Ashok has a great magic gift for tying rocks to clouds. Although he's really grounded and rooted in understanding philosophy, he has expertise in how to apply it in on-the-ground situations, and that's why I've asked him here today. He's founder and director of the Global Dialogue Institute, which has developed effective methods of deep dialogue for renovating cultural life. His audiobook, The Awakening of the Global Mind, is available through Sounds True. Ashok is also co-chair of the World Wisdom Council and co-convener of World Commission on Global Consciousness and Spirituality. These organizations bring leading and emerging world leaders like Deepak Chopra, Mikhail Gorbachev, Nobel laureates, and other thought leaders representing a broad spectrum of expertise. It brings them together in deep dialogue to help articulate global wisdom, vision, and values in addressing the most pressing concerns and crises on a global scale. Ashok is also a television host and is currently producer and host of Global Lens. I'm talking with Ashok today because it's so important to bring a wider, more global perspective. It's a bit of a departure from what's typically considered leadership development material, but I've asked him to join us in this series because I wanted to root our dialogue about values-driven leadership in tried and true philosophies that have served humanity for millennia. As a world-renowned expert on global philosophies, Ashok has a really unique perspective on who we are and why and how we do what we do. He brings a powerful depth and breadth to our series, and I'm so pleased to introduce you to my friend, Ashok Gangadine. Welcome, Ashok.
Thank you, Joni. That's wonderful. Yes, it's great to have our friendship over the years and our ongoing deep dialogue unfolding. Glad to be with you right now.
We've talked in many contexts, and this context is so critical because we both agree that leaders are really the people in the best positions to change the world, and that may not be so easy to see from the view from your chair when you've got to get the widgets produced or the services out and pull people together and move people around. But in the greater global perspective, each person doing their job as a leader is really in the most important places in the world to change the world.
Well, it's amazing now when we talk about a great shift on the planet and shifting into a more awakened culture that's sustainable in the face of the incredible crises we face in every aspect of our lives. It's clear to the leaders I'm working with, the World Wisdom Council, the World Commission on Global Consciousness, the evolutionary leaders, it's clear that there is something amazing shifting on the planet, and consciousness has something to do with it. And this is really something I hope will come out. We make our worlds with our minds. And one thing these leaders all share is the corporate business world is an enormous potential to be a great shifter on the planet. And with the leadership, the visionary leaders in business, when you say values-driven, to me that word from philosophy, values, goodness, ethics, consciousness are deeply connected. So consciousness-driven leaders with vision can really be enormously important in shifting the world to the new culture.
Absolutely. And when you say shifting to a new culture, I put up a poll on LinkedIn and asked people if they thought there was a new paradigm of leadership emerging. And it was a small sampling, about 20 people, but about half said no and about half said yes. So we don't have consensus about a new paradigm, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and your take on what's falling apart or what we're emerging from and what we're emerging into.
Well, yes, that's a great question. I'm not surprised that there is no consensus because there's deep confusion, Joni, about whether there's a shift, what is a shift, and there's so many takes on it. But from the point of view of global consciousness, global wisdom, and the great teachers of the planet over the last 3,000 years across the planet, east, west, north, and south, the wisdom leaders, the visionary leader of the past, all the way into the present, share the view that we make our world with our minds, our consciousness. Most of us don't get that. The reality that appears to us on our consciousness is directly shaped by the lens of our culture, worldview, perspective, religion, ideology that is shaped in our consciousness and our mind. So that's the ultimate technology from the point of view of philosophy and wisdom and enlightenment, that our consciousness shapes our reality. And the consensus of the great teachers all through the ages is if you're using an ego-based way of thinking, where you are in an ego form and pattern of consciousness, we don't realize it creates great fragmentation, polarization, breaches at every aspect of our inner life and outer lives, interpersonal, cultural, in the workplace, in the political, civic space. An ego consciousness yields an ego world. And so the consensus of the shift is that we've been in a painful evolutionary awakening and maturation from that stage of our consciousness development, ego-based, to a more integral, holistic, dialogic, that's a key word. Dialogic means dialogue way, where you really can see the other, open higher space for the other to show herself in her voice, other cultures, other religions, other perspectives, other orientations in the marketplace and in the workplace. So the shift really is a shift from an ego form of life to an integral, holistic, dialogic human being that is seen to be the mature form of being human.
And we're often fish in water. We may not think that we have a strong religion or ideology or whatever, but whether we do or we don't, we often don't recognize the water that we swim in. We take it for granted. And so when we think of a limiting culture, we don't really ever stop and pull apart and break down what that culture is.
Absolutely right, because it's our medium, it is our ecology, it's what's the most familiar, and therefore we most of us overlook it or don't see it. It's a medium in which we live. So that philosophers, all of whom, whether it's Socrates talking about humans need to wake up their rational minds and come out of the cave, so there's a kind of awakening, or Buddha's great awakening where he saw that humans are suffering. And this is whether in the workplace or the culture space, the home space, humans are suffering because they're stuck in this ego stage, and buying into thinking of themselves as objects and other people as objects. And that's the source of the suffering. So his great prescription for this, to change the workplace, was rehabilitate your patterns of mind, the Eightfold Path of mindful living, mindfulness. So what happens is that people who are accustomed to the ego way don't realize it. They're in a kind of trance or hypnotic state in a way, cultural hypnosis. And the great teachers say, wake up, come out of it, whether it's a cave or this addiction, as Buddha called it. We're addicted to our mental patterns and fixating on our stories. And they're all calling us to another level, another dimension of awakening. Jesus is doing that when he's calling on his disciples and the people around him to come into Christ consciousness, let go of the past, the place of sin and fragmentation and alienation and separation, which is a consensus across the planet. In the East, it's called samsara, that we have to come out of that medium into a new form, like the caterpillar to the butterfly would be a good analogy. The kind of pun I make on this is going from ego pillar to the Buddha fly.
I love that.
But imagine that happening in the workplace and in the cultural space.
So I want to unpack this idea of ego, because we have to show up some way in the world, and just like the butterfly needs the chrysalis, needs the caterpillar, we need an ego. We tend to make it bad and wrong to have an ego, but we want to make sure that we're not giving ego a bad rap, just that it is very limited, and that as long as our life is defined around only being that caterpillar, then we never really have the ability to turn into our full potential of the butterfly.
So I think it's extremely important, Joni, and and great traditions like the Buddhist tradition recognize that you don't demonize the people who are suffering. The whole point of a bodhisattva is like a Christ Buddha in the world, is to tend to the suffering because it's your own. The awakened leaders knew that because of the interconnectivity of all of reality, that if there are people who are suffering or in ignorance or in violence, that's part of you. You're connected with that, and you are implicated in tending to it. So there's no point in demonizing it and alienating it, but the whole point is to compassionately deal with that stage. And a friendly way to put it in that spirit is that, look, like any evolutionary process, just like the caterpillar to the butterfly, the human is in evolution. We've been in evolution all the way through, and that's an exciting part of the story. And ego-based thinking is a stage that seems natural when the child is seeing the world from her point of view and developing the consciousness of me and I'm different from mama, I'm different from other siblings, I'm different from the world around me. And you individuate yourself. You're forming the lens of your mind to shape your experience in your world. And cultures as a whole is a shared enterprise. I mean, if the tribe sees the world from their tribal perspective and world, and they share that in the culture, we shape each other in the culture, in a shared language and grammar of our reality, so to speak, then the point of ego-based, we could even put it differently. The lens you have, it's natural to take your lens to be the measure of reality because everything is showing up there to you. The trouble is when you encounter others, other worlds, other worldviews, other religions, other ideologies, and you're interpreting them through your lens. I call it monologue or monolens. Instead of just ego-based, it's a mono-based, linear way of using your mind. And what that does, and you can see the traces of this in the very violent patterns when breakdowns occur across the borders of our worlds, genocides, holocausts, breakdown in family relations and divorces, where members of the family can't connect and communicate because they're using their own lens to see the other. And they're not able to step back into dialogue. It's monologue they're in, ego-log, and to open up and really allow space. You have to dilate your heart and mind to open space, whether it's a workspace or on campus or in the family or in the church group or gathering or synagogue, wherever it may be, or between religions, certainly. If we just see the other through our own lens, which is ego-based thinking and mono-based, there's a profound violence to the other.
And we see that in corporate culture all the time because most of our leaders, if they went through any kind of formal training, they were trained in that win, profit at any cost, take yourself up, you have to get by getting over on somebody else, power over versus power with, and it's that caterpillar ego-based, mono-based consciousness that is really
competition and scarcity and dog eat dog and who can get the most profits. And the older paradigm is that a corporate world is driven by stocks and money and profits and the bottom line. And as you know, Joni, one of the exciting things in the last 2-3 decades especially, there's been a stirring among certain CEOs to realize that there is a higher way to be a business leader, the triple bottom line, so to speak, where you've got to consider the well-being of your workers, you've got to consider the environment. And if your business is having negative impacts on the ecology, tearing out the rainforest, whatever it may, strip mining, whatever form it may be, or the abuse of workers, using child labor, anything like that exploits human beings, your business is unsustainable. So that the bottom line for business has been growing, as you know. And I think the direction of this is precisely moving towards a more dialogic, holistic, integral way of being a visionary leader.
When you say dialogic, that's interesting because so many of the limited leaders aren't in dialogue with the people around them. They say, I'm the boss, I'm the leader, and with that consciousness goes a sort of know-it-all. And, the Buddhists say if you meet the Buddha on the road, shoot him. Because, as long as there's this understanding that consciousness is an end game and it's arrived at and it's all done, then that's not the real Buddha. That's not the real understanding. And I think, more evolved leaders really get that, and less evolved leaders see where they are as sort of an end game.
Absolutely. So that art of being able to listen to others, whether it's other business leaders in other corporate worlds or other cultures. If an American corporate leader goes into Japan or to deal with China or India or Africa or wherever it may be, she needs to really be sensitized to their cultural life and ways, to really meet them in this open space of dialogue. And certainly in our backyard, in our own home court, what you're saying is if we have this kind of closed-minded top-down vision where you impose hierarchically your vision on those around you, on those who are under your charge, it can be a disaster in the breakdown of human communication. the breaking of morale, so that a team leader, a visionary leader with his skills and literacy and art of dialogue, and what I call in my institute deep dialogue, helps to open the sacred space of the workplace so that each person can feel treasured and step into a sacred space where they can flourish and come to peak performance. Athletes know, team leaders, athletes know that when they're in the zone, they are in peak performance. And that being in the zone is one of the ways of measuring, are we in this integral, open, holistic flow of being in the moment mindfully, or am I ego-driven? I want to win. I'm going to bash the other team down. I mean, this is well known now, and the term "in the zone" is a way of capturing it. Is our business in the zone? Our work.
There's this concept of heuristics, and heuristics is being so completely in the moment that you make great decisions because your intuition is sharp, your presence and acumen in that moment is sharp. You bring all that you bring to that moment, and you've done enough personal homework that you're totally available in that moment to really make good decisions. And that's based on sort of goal methodologies and rule-based decision making. And Oprah never set a goal. She's entirely heuristic, and that's not something I necessarily recommend, but I think it's important to have a good balance of both. But that's an example of just how extraordinary. She's probably the wealthiest woman in the world, and sometimes I think it's hard for people to make the leap to equate that these kinds of more soft data, more esoteric kinds of concepts actually lead to better hard data in terms of profit and retention and things like that.
Absolutely, and certainly so we could see that in many contexts, but certainly Phil Jackson of the Lakers, who is known in his book Sacred Hoops and his well-known leadership of his team, he meditates. He's using Zen methods with his team, and that's why they've won more championships than any other team. So the bottom line really is, if you want peak performance from your workplace and from your culture, from your campus, from your educational institution, whatever it may be, these skills are really tried and true for millennia by our great teachers. That's the point. This is not some newfangled thing that's coming up. It's been tried and true scientifically in spirituality and consciousness, that if reality is a field of flow and interconnectivity, and we can get a higher mind operating process to surf and be in sync with the pulse of reality, that's what we're talking about. Then we're going to be at a higher scientific level of effectiveness in every aspect of our lives.
And that's the zone. What you're talking about really is the zone, and whether someone gets there through meditation or through walking in nature or doing art or being creative in some way, music, or whatever it takes to get in that place, it's flexing that muscle and getting some facility in that zone space that actually translates back behind your desk into some profoundly different ways of approaching leadership.
Absolutely right. And so if you realize the older top-down model of issuing orders, so to speak, in a chain of command is a great way, the dysfunctional way to alienate. So the butterfly metaphor for the space, the sacred space of a business or educational institution, whatever it may be, or a team, is to create, and it takes objective skills and capacities of the art of dialogue, how to dilate an open space so that others can flourish and step into it and feel treasured and honored. Because that's one of the greatest values in our American culture, the individuality, and certainly in a Quaker culture such as I teach in Haverford College, founded by the Quakers. The Quaker way is that is steeped into the American way of individuals are sacred. And when you open that space, and that's the art of leadership, can the leader help to hold and open the space and to help renovate the space of the ecology of the workspace so that persons can flourish and feel treasured and therefore thrive and reach that peak performance? You're right, Joni, there are many, many ways to get into that.
And the old paradigm of leadership said that doesn't belong in the workplace. In fact, the more you do of that, the more frou-frou you are, and the less likely you are to be a strong leader because that's too effeminate, it's too woo-woo, it's too out there, it has nothing to do with getting the widgets made or the services done. And we didn't have the measuring sticks to understand these things before, and through work like Richard Barrett does at the Barrett Center for Values, and other people around the world are finally documenting that this is not external or extraneous to good leadership, that this is integral to good leadership, and now we can measure that.
Absolutely right. And that's part of the exciting revolution of the last 30, 40 years. And certainly in our Global Dialogue Institute, when we bring deep dialogue to the business place in terms of business ethics, and which means a consciousness, what is the ethos for business, it's clear that we're in the midst of a great shift. And what's coming out is exactly your theme, Joni, that it's being seen to be, in terms of even from the measure of profitability and performance and higher success, there are clear indices that being good makes good sense.
Mm-hmm. That you can do well and do good. That's the fear for a lot of, especially smaller business owners. Is if I'm spending my time doing good, then the fear is that I can't do well.
Mm-hmm. That's right. In terms of the psychology of the workplace, I mean, when you say widgets, that creating the widget and the assembly line model where the person is simply a machine, that is really a dehumanizing situation where people just step into a machine and they have to do the widget, so to speak, and you drive it. You slave drive people. I mean, that is passé, way passé. So imagine it's simple common sense. If your workers and your colleagues in the workplace are feeling valued and they have high morale implies higher productivity and quality. And that's the kind of quality control we want at all levels of our business.
Absolutely, and it translates into great profits. So I like to think of this in terms of yin and yang, the Oriental philosophy, because it takes out gender issues. Yin is more feminine, yang is more masculine, but it isn't so gender related. Yin is more expansive, yang is more concentrated. So the yang, we have to produce widgets in this culture, otherwise we wouldn't have our houses and our toasters and our stoves and things,
and cars,
and our cars and the phones that we're all listening on. So that's the yang. But the yin is the how and these softer indicators that we've been talking about. And you have such extraordinary, deep expertise in this yin domain. And I'd love for you to help us connect the dots between what some of the ancient philosophies and spiritual teachings tell us in terms of developing values, things like courage, fortitude, vision.
I mean, my field is philosophy, as you know, and people often don't know that Sophia is the feminine who embodies wisdom. So my field is phile, and philo is love, and love of Sophia, the love of wisdom. So wisdom is precisely seen as the feminine logos Sophia. Logos is the reason, the speech, the logic, the theory, all of that. And the Sophia is the wisdom, the embodiment of this in the life form, in every aspect of our lives. So lover of wisdom, all through the ages, whether it's Buddha's wisdom or Krishna's yoga in the Gita or Jesus Christ consciousness, they all sing a chorus of what you're pointing to, that it's not soft, or if soft may not be the best word, but it takes great courage.
That's why I like yin, because it doesn't have too much meaning to everybody. It's very neutral.
Okay, good. And so yes, at the heart of courage and temperance and justice and all of these great virtues that moral philosophers speak about across the planet, it's exactly on this yin principle of daring to make yourself vulnerable, to open up and step back from privileging your lens, your perspective, your worldview, not to impose it in a patriarchal way on the other, but to open up. And so the opening up of sacred space for the other is at the heart of this art of respectful dealings with one another and the flourishing of space from that closure to an open, human, user-friendly space. And that has been echoed all through. That's a heart of ethics and moral consciousness. When Jesus said, when I was in prison, you visited me. When I was hungry, you fed me. He understood the I-thou relationship of reality, that the I is connected with the other, with the thou. And that I-thou, Martin Buber made that famous in his book, Ich and Du, I and Thou, that one way to relate to the others as an object, as an it. That's cold and hard, and that's really what leads to all kinds of violence. Because if you treat the other as an object, and as we know in the so-called feminist revolution, women were saying, don't treat me as an object. But that mantra really goes for everything. Don't treat your kids as an object. Most of all, don't treat yourself as an object. And that ego-based consciousness that we were talking about before is that adolescent form of our development where we objectify ourselves on others and other cultures and other people and other perspectives. And when you do that, disaster follows. So it's moving from that kind of militaristic, aggressive, imposing of your lens on the other to being open and vulnerable in that sense. But that's where strength and courage comes from, stepping back and opening to listen to the other, deep listening in the workplace, listening to other colleagues, listening to other cultures, listening to other perspectives. That's the art that I think you're pointing to. That's what ethics is all about.
Who have you seen through your years of being in the literature? Who has embodied that in the past?
Well, I mean, again, this is why I'm pointing to the great elders like Buddha. Buddha's compassion, when he says, when you wake up out of the place of suffering, he wanted to remove the arrow of suffering from people. And that arrow of suffering is their ego-based consciousness. And to help them renovate and kick the habit and rehabilitate their minds into this space of interconnectivity and flow, it's in the zone, as we used that earlier, that's when you discover your connection with the other and with the ecology.
And how do you bring that mindfulness that Buddha had about that? How do you bring that kind of mindfulness when you're sitting behind a desk and you've got all the pressures of time and money and issues, and how do you access that and use it in practical ways?
Well, I think that's a great question. It's not only when you're sitting behind the desk and you're getting barraged with all kinds of deadlines and appointments and problems in the workspace, but to know that when you walk into the office, when you cross your receptionist outside or your assistant outside of your door, that you don't just walk by in that kind of closed mind and not even notice him or her. You notice everyone around you. You pick up on them. You're aware, you're situationally aware. A good quarterback on the field who is not situationally aware is not going to be effective as a quarterback. We know that in terms of performance. And that's certainly the pilot who landed the aircraft into the Hudson in a life-and-death situation was heads up. He was heads up in the moment. He had to make strategic, instant decisions. And that is situational awareness. So what we're talking about of mindfulness, you can't, I mean, that pilot had to be practicing that all through his career in order to meet that moment. So it takes training to learn the skills and arts of deep dialogue. You're meeting people all the time, 24/7. You go home to see your spouse, him or her, and how do you engage that other? You're facing your children. Are you there? Are you showing up? Are you listening? Are you looking into their eyes? Over and over, 24/7, every time around, we're encountering the other. That's where the practice. That's the laboratory of awakening consciousness and mindfulness. Not only when you just go and sit behind the desk into the office. So you take it into the office with you.
And that requires being vulnerable, and that's something that so many leaders have been trained away from. That if they don't maintain the mystique and the exterior of being uncrackable and vulnerable, then they won't maintain their leaderful position. But the data is really proving now the opposite. But that vulnerability is huge.
When you use a yin term, vulnerability, a guy, especially a CEO type, an alpha A, whatever you call that term, personality, Aikido in the martial arts, that's another context we could look at it, because guys, so to speak, if we're talking about guys, can see the martial arts as something that is powerful. What is the martial arts? In Aikido, in the yin principle, when you're in touch with the chi force, to use a Chinese language, idea of the chi energy, when your opponent comes at you, You don't meet it head on. You allow them to, you move in Aikido to take their energy and turn it back to them. So what you're calling vulnerability is at the heart of the martial arts. How to move energy skillfully, on the battlefield, so to speak. And so that's another way you could look at this, not to put it in a militaristic, but because martial arts is nonviolent. It's a nonviolent way of dealing with an aggressive attack towards you, because you're using a higher calculus. As Gandhi said, an eye for an eye, if you work at that level, the whole world would be blind. So that the real leader, the visionary leader, precisely to have vision, who opens the higher consciousness and mindfulness, is superior on the battlefield. And people just don't know that. So it's vulnerability, yes, but vulnerability means putting down the privileging of your lens and laying it on other people, to stand open, to allow others to speak and listen deeply, and to speak from that deeper space.
In history, you bring up the battlefield, and I think one of the most profound lessons is from the Bhagavad Gita, which is what Hinduism is based on. It's the holy text of Hinduism, and the story of Arjuna.
Mm-hmm. And he's a warrior who has broken down. He's a CEO, who is the Bhagavad Gita opens on this theme that Arjuna, the great war hero, sees in this battle a fratricidal war with his own relatives. He looks across the battlefield just when the conch shells are blowing and the banners are waving to charge. Krishna who is the high voice, the integral, holistic lover voice.
The God figure.
Exactly, the God figure, Krishna. Right, is his charioteer, and Arjuna has a breakdown, a midlife crisis. He sees, I can't kill my own people. My victory means nothing to me if I defeat them at that price. And he drops his weapon. His whole ethics falls apart. That's the old paradigm. That's the ego pillar, or the caterpillar stage ended. And he turned to Krishna and said, Krishna, help me. And Krishna knew that he was ready to go into the yoga science, which is the kind of vulnerability you're talking about, to go into integrity. He has to get connected with a higher reality field. He had to grow up at that point, and that's where he becomes a true martial artist. And someone like Gandhi, another kind of CEO that we often admire, use that technology of the Atma, the higher self, to bring it into the marketplace of the culture in the battle with India, to liberate India from the occupation by the British. And he tapped that power. And this little guy in physical stature had enormous power to call the nation together. How did he do it? His CEO power was exactly what we're talking about. He tapped the Satya power, the truth force. And that's courage, supreme courage and power and empowerment. So CEOs and business leaders who are in positions of power must know that when they open up into this deeper space and higher way of thinking, mindfulness, they're not giving up power. They're gaining enormous power. That's what someone like Mandela said in one of his famous quotes. What scares us is not that we're insignificant, but that we're marvelous and powerful. And people can be phobic about that.
Yeah, actually that was misattributed. That actually was Marianne Williamson who he quoted in his speech. But
I see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, our theory is that
she's one of our members on the Evolutionary Leaders, so we're working together. We're colleagues in that group.
But, it's kind of what Buddha said, there's nothing to strive toward. It's not a going out to get this power. It's just a falling into, an awakening into. And part of that falling into is, that things kind of have to fall apart, too.
Well, yes, that's a very important point, Joni, because and all of our great leaders knew when Jesus said you got to die to be born again, or Krishna is saying to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, hey, buddy, it's going to be scary to let go of your story and move up into this yoga zone, but I'm with you. I'll guard you while you go through this. All of the teachers knew, and that crossing from one to the other, this self-birthing to the higher power and empowerment and effectiveness is a very scary, difficult transition. And that's really what our great teachers have been developing, ways to help guide us in that rite of passage, to upscale to this higher form of life. And
do you have any advice for someone who can't stop and read all those texts and unpack them? And, what extractions can you take from that someone can lean on in the moment of having to make a decision?
That's a great question. And if you don't study all of these great texts and know those traditions, but it's around us in our culture, of course, because we know of, for example, Jesus and Abraham, one of our great CEOs, when he had to face listening to God. Do I put God first, or do I put my agenda first? And the whole question of sacrificing his highest value, which is he got his son Isaac. Do I let go of Isaac to put God first, or do I hold on? That whole challenge that all of our traditions resonate with us, is that every human being, not just CEOs, but every one of us, has to face in our encounter with the other. If it's a guy confronting his female significant other, and he is laying his lens on her, and he's not able to listen. Men are from Mars and women from Venus. Tries to capture the breakdown of the two kinds of lenses and two ways to be, the yin and yang, that theme again. In that sense, you have to be able to open up and listen. So we're all facing that in any case. So in spouses who are having breakdowns in communications and worldviews and orientations, are learning in a very painful way after breakups and separations and divorces, breakup of families, that we've got to find a way to communicate. We've got to find a way to reach each other and find compassion. And so that micro level at every moment, am I listening to my children? Am I listening to my teenage son or daughter? Am I listening to my colleagues? Right? Over and over, we're facing that micro letting go of privileging your perspective, your lens, over the other, which is kind of colonial violence to the other.
And am I listening to my own heart? Because we've been taught that mind is so important, and it is. But the word wisdom, to my mind, I go back to the Native American teachings where the different tribes had to use sign language with each other because they didn't all speak the same languages. So the word for wisdom was to touch the head and the heart and bring the hands together to show that these two things come together. And
absolutely. I call that the heart mind, by the way, that wisdom, Sophia, awakening wisdom, is awakening the heart mind, because the word mind is dominated by the caterpillar stage, so to speak, the top-down, my lens first, I'm number one, mono-lens, monocentric mind, and monologue. I mean, it is exactly that, and moving into the more dilated heart mind. So the ego mind is mind-oriented in that sense. All our great wisdom teachers saying, you got to let go of that mind. So all of yoga, for example, is when you go into the yoga zone, the axiom, the starting point of yoga is quieting ego mind, so that the higher integral mind can blossom and come forth. And when you have that integral mind, that's what Gandhi tapped, you are able to move mountains in terms of coherence and connecting the dots and power. And a good CEO leader, a visionary leader, has to be highly skilled in connecting the dots at all levels. And the more successful you are at that, in that calculus, in integral calculus, the more powerful and effective you're going to be, and the more successful you're going to be in your business in every respect.
Yeah, and I see this kind of on a pendulum, and for millennia now, all of our ideas of leadership and success, and it's all been pretty much male-dominated. All the great religious and political leaders have almost exclusively been male, and our definitions of these things have been very young, very goal, outcome-oriented. This idea of consciousness, transformation, these sort of higher-level thinking, more yin thinking, is really kind of new on the landscape, and it's not so new that now, at least we have it documented, leaders who were doing this 25 years ago were just considered on the fringe, even though they were producing successes. But now, we understand it, but I almost feel like our pendulum needs to swing a little bit in error to the yin side, because we've lost that perspective for so many years that I think people have to maybe risk being a little too woo-woo, a little bit too yin, a little bit too heart-centered, so that they can actually find the true balance of where that pendulum really is in the middle, because our definitions are so skewed for so many generations that even if you have these ideas and have developed them strongly in your life, again, we're fish in water, and we don't know how much we're influenced by the millennia of thinking that's been so young-dominated.
Right, that's well said, Joni. And, when you think of matriarchal cultures that are governed by a more feminist way, and ethos of being, And what's usually in the feminist revolution, and not that I'm subscribing to it, but I'm saying one of the themes that has emerged in trying to articulate, is there a more feminine-oriented way of empowerment and being in the world? And one is care and compassion and nurturing, in that maternal type of creative energy. And matriarchal cultures have practiced that, in contrast to the more patriarchal, militaristic, aggressive, territorial type of models. And one of the great signs of moving to a wisdom culture, especially now when people talk about there's a great shift on the planet, 2012, Mayan calendar, and many other calendars, and that whole sense of shift, all that mythology of shift, the common theme you hear is that the rise of the feminine is a signal of the shift into a higher sustainable culture. So it really echoes the point you're making, that those virtues that you are calling yin, and all through our conversation now, even though it may come with vulnerability and heart-centered, and therefore feelings and compassion and sympathy and empathy, all of those nurturing virtues are really a sign of great empowerment. That's what we need to see in creating that balance. When you translate that, just to wrap up this little moment, I mean, with nature, Mother Nature, if we're objectifying it and violating nature, as in the Gulf puncture deep beneath the ocean, and so and Mother Earth was bleeding, and the taking down of the forests, and the disrespect to nature, strip mining and topsoil, and melting polar ice caps, to violate nature is another form of the aggression. And so to be sustainable now, we've got to find the ethos of nurturing and care and heart-centered leadership and vision to lead the way into the sustainable culture.
Yeah, and in terms of doing that in the moment on the job, when I'm coaching, sometimes I encourage people to just say, I need a moment. I'm not going to make that decision right now, even though we needed it yesterday, and I understand that it feels like an emergency and it's really pressing. But to take that breath, to take that pause, and I'm even a big believer in the bathroom. I mean, sometimes it's, excuse me, I'm going to go to the bathroom for a minute, and just be in the stall with yourself. Find a space, take a walk out, preferably take a walk outside. That's usually best to really pull out. But to create those moments, to take a breath, to take a pause, to close the door, to maybe even listen to 1 minute of music or something that will start to reconnect you with that zone we talked about earlier, so that you can actually make a balanced and informed and wise decision.
Absolutely right. And taking that time out or that break is so important, because when you say the word emergency, what you do when you go into this dilated heart-mind space of wisdom and vision is precisely to connect the dots, as we said. That's where you can have emergence. If you're facing an emergency, you need emergence, which means in philosophy and state of the art now that something new and co-creative emerges out of that moment. If you're just closed-minded and you're going by en route of what was in the past, you're blocking the crisis you face now from occasioning a creative and a co-creative mindful, like a great quarterback in the moment, who's going to have to come up with a creative solution. That's emergence. We need emergence for emergency. And a good, skillful, visionary leader, to be powerful, has to know and develop the habits in her life of taking that moment to pause and listen to the higher wisdom, listen to Sophia, listen to the heart, listen to the connections, feel the implications, get more coherent. And that is greater power. So wisdom brings power and empowerment and effectiveness in quarterbacking on the playing field in a very crisis situation.
I have a client, this reminds me of her, that she is brilliant at all of these distinctions of leadership that we're uncovering on this series, and really, truly a visionary leader. And she's a top-level executive in the defense industry. She has about 900 people working under her. She speaks this language. She'll shut her door, take her moment, and meditate. She calls it meditation. I don't think it's a formal method that she uses, but she'll really sit with things. She's very dialogical, but most of the people around her are military ex-colonels, are people who are really very much functioning in the old paradigm. And sometimes when she's having communication issues, I say, you have to understand you're speaking Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what kinds of things can people do when they're exercising these ideas and the people around them are looking at them like they're from Mars?
Well, again, that's the funny language you're using. Men are from Mars and women from Venus. And now you said the woman, the person who's speaking this language is speaking Greek, and that just made me think of Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom. It is like an alien person. When you're in a new paradigm, Joni, as you know from your own life and your practice, you're one of the women, Sophias in the world that I admire so much. You're embodying this higher script. It's a higher script. Just think of the ego script is like a mind operating process. If you're using a certain stage of operation on your computer and you upgrade twice the power to a higher operating system, and we all know it's faster and it's more powerful, and that it's like that when you go from the ego mind script and way of being, what you call the old paradigm, to the new paradigm. It is the software for the mind is enormous, because your calculus now is able to connect and move and take in variables at a much higher level of intelligence, and it's like another language. That's why when Jesus was speaking this higher Christ language script, his disciples didn't get it. It was like Greek to them, or Hebrew, whatever. They didn't get it, and it created a lot of turbulence, as we well know historically. When he would say, when I was in prison, you visited me, and when I was hungry, you fed me, in the higher script, which means we're connected, and the I is in the other, and when you tend to the other, you tend to yourself. That message of higher consciousness is just a different script. When Buddha was speaking that script, his disciples didn't understand it, and all of Buddhist philosophy for centuries was trying to make sense of his Greek. And certainly Arjuna, if you read the Bhagavad Gita, chapter after chapter, Arjuna didn't understand what Krishna was saying. He keeps saying, Krishna, you're confusing me. You're saying knowledge is better. Now you say I should act, but you said action isn't, which is higher. I want to know this. And on he screams every step of the way until he reaches chapter 11, when he's ready to open the third eye, the heart mind, and dilate his consciousness to the new script. He didn't have the literacy. So the shift for leaders at all levels, in the academy, in politics, in business, in our family life, in our religious life, they're all being called, we are all being called to upscript to the higher mind operating process, and to cross that language barrier so that we could communicate in deep dialogue across borders.
I love that word upscript, because that really is the pathway into a new era. And, Arjuna went kicking and screaming, and a lot of us do go kicking and screaming into change, and a lot of us embrace change. And in some ways it doesn't matter, because that's really at the ego level, but the reality is that here we are at a precipice of change, because we have to, and maybe because evolutionarily we were programmed to at some level by some entity or not. But there is this new paradigm opening that seems like it won't tolerate anything else. And it doesn't matter whether we embrace it or don't embrace it, that there's something upon us that has to be reckoned with.
That's beautifully said, and that's really what our wisdom leaders, the ones that I'm dancing with, all recognize, that it's not something that's up to us. Something is happening in the culture. It's been long coming. So what you call the new paradigm, when I point out that Jesus is, and Buddha and Krishna and Socrates and Moses and Abraham and Mohammed and all of these visionary great leaders and founders and innovators are all part of the consensus now of calling us to upscript to a higher form of being a human. It's been centuries and millennia emerging. So the so-called new paradigm is deeply grounded in the scientific experiments of thousands of years of the laboratory of culture. And it won't go away. Being a compassionate human being is not just a whimsical thing. That's our birthright. It's our heritage. To be a dialogue being. We're not ego sapiens. We're logo sapiens. I use the word logos from the Greek, like the logos Sophia. A way to put this message you just mentioned is that who are we really? Are we ego beings? Are we ego sapiens? Because the word sapien, as you know, from Homo sapien, sapien means wisdom. That's the Sophia word. And if the evolutionary shift to Homo sapiens was a breakthrough to a human species, and we now see that an ego sapien is not sapient. That's why people say sapien sapiens, trying to capture what we're talking about. An awakened Homo sapien is what we're talking. That's the shift of a maturation as a whole human being. It won't go away. It's here. And the exciting part of the crisis we face is that the cultures we have now and the corporate structures, institutional structures, and political forms need to grow up. And we have no choice. We're in a crisis at every level of our culture on this planet. And crisis is an opportunity for upscripting and upscaling to another level. That's what moves evolution. And so I feel the good, exciting news is we have no choice. We're in the 11th hour. We have to upscript to survive and to flourish and to be sustainable. We have no choice.
Well, and the other good news is that for the first time in the history of the world, we can do it consciously. We came out of the industrial age. We went into an information age. And out of that information age, we got universal access to information that opened up possibilities in our minds and on the planet that never existed before. And some say that we are already in the beginning transitioning out of the information age into a transformational age. And I don't know. First of all, I'd like to know if you have another word for it, because I've heard the next stage called many different things, and I guess historians will name it for sure in a long time to come. But also, I'm wondering.
Age of Enlightenment. I call it the Age of Enlightenment, the transformation, and I'm using that word not lightly. Enlightenment means awakening, and awakening means upscripting, and upscripting means dilating your heart and mind and growing up. And so, what many of us might think of enlightenment as this woo-woo, strange, spooky thing that a Buddha or a Krishna or an Abraham or Moses or Jesus might have, but not us, not at all. They were all trying to help model for us as great CEOs, so to speak, that's our birthright. We are meant to be awakened beings. And so the age of transformation, that's the transformation. At the beginning of our conversation, we're saying, what is this shift, which is a transformation? It's from the information age where we're getting content in the box. Information in that sense is almost a kind of ego model of information, like a computer getting more information, more data. But now wisdom is waking up and learning how to absorb and use that information for transformation that's going to bring a culture that's sustainable for all of us, where we all flourish together on the sacred planet. So I think to call it awakening mind, global consciousness, or there are many ways to word that transformation we're in. And again, I'm trying to remind us that our great evolutionary elders of the planet were calling us to this for millennia, this transformation. So it's not a newfangled thing. It's tried and true in the laboratory of evolution and culture for millennia.
And it's a huge concept, but it happens one decision to the next. It happens by getting a sense of what that secretary is feeling as you walk through your door. It comes through in the very little day-to-day things.
Oh, no, that's extremely important. And one of the things that working with the leaders that I'm honored to work with, it's that the micro is the macro. And a great CEO leader needs to understand that micro. In the higher calculus, every act that you perform in the micro level has a ripple effect all the way through. And that's the macro. So what's happening at the macro level on the planet, right down to the micro, and it comes down to this, Joni. If I'm using this old paradigm, ego, violent way of laying my lens on the other person around me, whether it's my assistant outside my door or the person I'm speaking to on the phone or my children at home, wherever it is, or my spouse, if I'm using that, then I'm part of the problem. I'm creating the problem at the micro level. And the so-called butterfly effect that's being discovered and recognized now by physicists who understand the connection of the field. So science is confirming this. Reality is an interconnected web such that the movement of the wings of the butterfly in the rainforest of Brazil is connected with the typhoon in the Pacific. That's huge. That means every CEO in her micro actions has a ripple effect, a butterfly, I call it the Buddha-fly effect, when you go from the ego pillar to the Buddha fly. The Buddha fly effect is to realize, oh my God, every act at the micro level is in a web of connections that ripples throughout the entire field. And if you begin to practice that with that awareness and know that nodding respectfully to your co-workers as you walk by, when I'm on campus and I'm walking to my office and I see the grounds crew working, making the campus beautiful, I always stop and wave and smile and nod. They love it. They get it. It matters. So micro is macro.
And it matters. Ashok Gangadeen, thank you so much for being with us today. I think you've stretched our thoughts in so many ways. You can read more about Ashok at awakeningmind.org. That's awakeningmind.org. And my website, I'm Joni Carley. My website is leaderfuledge.com. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, Ashok.
Pleasure being with you, Joni. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.